Hey, it is 3.1, step 2. What is modernism? Our learning objective is students will be able to read, analyze, and evaluate pages 1 to 58 of the things they carried. So we're going to talk a little bit about postmodernism here. Our first question, why is postmodernism hard to define? Postmodernism is what we have after modernism. And modernism is really the worldview you associate with the rise of modern science. People believe in progress, the role of human reason, or the idea that reason will eventually be able to give us every answer to every problem. Postmodernism comes after this. And the first difficulty in defining it is that everybody gets a try at defining postmodernism because postmodernism itself undermines the idea that there can be a single authoritative definition of anything. And so when we say, this is a movement that says nothing can be defined singularly, then it's pretty hard to define it itself. We'll give a try anyway. Also, since modernism is in the name, right here, postmodernism is part modernism. The two are two sides of the same coin, if you will. Postmodernism emerges from and reacts to modernism. Both reject tradition and experiment with form in art, but while modernism seeks deeper truths to try to help us move up towards this inevitable progress through innovation, postmodernism questions the very possibility of universal truths existing. It was maybe defined the best. Before I tell you about who defined it the best, I wanted to give you an analogy. I forgot. The analogy is the Tower of Babel. Do you know this story? It comes from the Bible, and the story basically goes like this. Humanity all speaks one language. Everybody understands each other because everybody speaks the same language. And humanity unites to build a tower reaching heaven. And God sees this pride of humanity to think that they could build a tower all the way to heaven. And so confuses the language and scatters people across the earth. The unfinished tower then becomes a symbol of human ambition, divine intervention, and the origin of diverse languages. So when you're thinking about modernism and postmodernism, modernism might be the building of the Tower of Babel, while postmodernism is after everyone was scattered, speaking different languages. So they're connected. One kind of creates the other or leads to the other, but they are two different things. So modernism is symbolized by the tower trying to reach up and replace God, while postmodernism is the Babel that came after that, when people lost the ability to communicate because there's no common language or common presuppositions. All right, now I'll give you that definition that I told you about. This comes from Jean-François Lyotard, and particularly his book that was published in 1979 called The Postmodern Condition, a Report on Knowledge. And this is a line of his that was translated because the book is in French. And he says that postmodernism is the incredulity towards meta-narratives. So let's unpack this a little bit. First of all, incredulity is not believing or wondering if maybe it's not true, right? And meta-narratives can also be translated as big stories. So big stories are large universal stories or theories like progress, enlightenment, reason, things like human beings by way of human reason are capable of knowing everything and capable of solving all problems. Another big story is that by way of modern medicine, we're able to cure all ills. So there are a lot of big stories, and we believe a lot of them. Postmodernism is saying, what if they're not true? It's an incredulity, a skepticism towards these large narratives. So that's probably the best definition that we have. Let's talk about aspects of postmodernism in literary art in particular. We're going to use Margaret Atwood's The Handmaid's Tale to help us with this. So the first one is fragmentation. Postmodern works break traditional linear structure using disjointed or layered forms. Offred's narrative constantly shifts from past and present. Memories intrude unexpectedly. Suddenly we're in a flashback. Scenes sometimes repeat with variations. Think about the Nick scenes, for example. And key events are missing or unclear. The story is literally pieced together from fragmented tapes, we find out after we read historical notes. The second, irony and self-awareness, is another key component of postmodern literary art. And in The Handmaid's Tale, this means that postmodern texts often comment on their own status as stories or constructed artifacts. Offred, for example, repeatedly draws attention to this by saying, I don't want to tell this story, or I want to believe this is a story I'm telling. And her ironic tone undercuts the seriousness of Gilead's ideology, showing awareness of narrative manipulation, that the fact that you are the one who is telling the story manipulates what is heard by an audience. The third is intertextuality, and this is that meaning is created through references to other texts, histories, and cultural codes. Things like biblical passages that are included in The Handmaid's Tale, Puritan history, news and media, even academic discourse in that last chapter, historical notes, shape how Gilead justifies power. And that historical notes chapter really reframes the entire novel as an archival academic document, a primary source, echoing scholarly genres. The fourth one, blurred boundaries. Postmodern works mix or destabilize distinctions between genres, between voices, between cultures, between high or low art. In The Handmaid's Tale, we have dystopia, we have memoir, we have political satire even, as well as some gothic horror and feminist critique. And it puts these, very different genres right next to each other, using high literary references as well as everyday pop culture kinds of memories. The fifth one, challenges to narrative authority. Postmodernism questions who can speak, whose stories are valued, and whether any narrator can ever be trusted. In The Handmaid's Tale, Offred is an unreliable narrator. She admits that she reconstructs events, censors herself, and sometimes invents different versions of scenes. The historical notes chapter challenges her authority at all by reinterpreting her testimony through these male scholars looking back at Offred and what she had to say, almost sort of making fun of her at times. The sixth item, political and identity-based critique. Postmodern texts often interrogate power structures tied to gender, race, class, sexuality, and institutions. In The Handmaid's Tale, Atwood exposes systems of patriarchal control, reproductive coercion, religious fundamentalism, and state surveillance. The novel critiques how political ideologies manipulate identity and bodily autonomy. And then finally, 7 is ambiguous meaning. Postmodernism resists singular interpretations and embraces uncertainty or open-endedness. The ending intentionally withholds Offred's fate in the book. The last chapter in the current timeline is just her going into the van, not knowing what's going to happen. The historical notes section lets us know she survived, but it adds these competing interpretations, preventing a final authoritative reading. The truth of Offred's account remains unresolved. So how do these aspects work in the things they carried? Well, we have all of these things once again. Fragmentation, you'll notice, comes up because the chapters really work like separate stories that are sometimes only interrelated, and sometimes they contradict each other. Events are repeated with variations, time jumps too, fluidly between chapters, before the war, during the war, and then years after. And so it creates kind of a patchwork rather than a linear war narrative. For the second one, irony and self-awareness, O'Brien frequently comments on how he crafts his story. The narrator talks about himself as if he is the author crafting story, admitting when details are invented or altered for truth, in quotation marks. He even jokes about the impossibility of telling a war story the right way, revealing the artificiality of narration. For intertextuality, O'Brien alludes to traditional war literature right away in the before the narrative even begins. He does this. And he deliberately rewrites or subverts it. He draws on oral storytelling traditions, memoir, myth, and journalism. The stories contain echoes of past war narratives while also calling them into question. For the blurred boundaries, the line between Tim O'Brien, the author, and Tim O'Brien, the character, is deliberately unstable. The book blends fiction and memoir, which is nonfiction, combat realism, and magical imagery, truth and fabrication, often without even signaling where one ends and the other begins. Challenges to narrative authority work similarly. O'Brien's narrator openly admits he lies, and so watch for that as you're reading. He retells the same event differently in different chapters. He claims that emotional truth outweighs actual factual occurrency. His contradictory stories force readers to question reliability and the authority of war narratives in general. For number 6, the book critiques U.S. militarism, national myths of heroism, and the pressures placed on young men during the draft. It explores how masculinity, patriotism, fear, and guilt shape identity in wartime and how those narratives are manipulated socially and politically. And then finally, for number 7, I can't tell you too much because I don't want to give anything away, but you'll notice as you're reading that stories end inconclusively sometimes. There's not there's not a moral of the story. And if there is, it's an ironic one that's sort of making fun of the idea of having a moral of the story in the first place. And then by the end, you'll have to determine what level of resolution there is when you've reached the end of the book. Okay, thanks for learning a little bit about postmodern art today, looking particularly at the two texts that we're reading this semester.